Well, yeah, hi everybody, and thank you so much for coming to my talk today on William Godwin and the Paranoid Gothic. And thank you to Sam for inviting me to share my research on this author with you guys today. So I will start off by introducing myself. So I'm Simon Clewes, and I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And kind of really broadly, my research area falls somewhere between English literature and sexuality and gender studies. I've got a background in both of them. So my degree was originally in English and American literatures at Keele University. And then a few years later, Birmingham launched this brand new master's that was sexuality and gender studies, which I did around about 2015. And I specialized in English literature within that, and that kind of led me on to the PhD that I'm doing at the moment, or kind of coming towards the conclusion of. I'm in thesis writing up at the moment, so this has been quite nice to sort of do an overview of my research for this. Now I know what I'm sort of vaguely talking about. So more specifically, I trace connections between kind of 21st century queer theory and trans studies, so the work of specific theorists working on gender, sexuality, family, kinship more broadly, and trace connections between that and the kind of later 18th century, early 19th century, so the sort of Romantic era, and look at how authors who were kind of experimenting with different forms of sexuality and gender at that time, how their work can be seen to have anticipated a lot of that would emerge hundreds of years later. So kind of tracing queer and trans histories really through the literature of this era. So kind of an example of that I'm currently working on is I've got a conference paper and also an article that's the idea of sort of non-binary Godwin. So it's the sense of looking at how Godwin's sort of theory of the kind of female and male body and how that affects one's kind of like who they are as an individual, how his sort of philosophies of that can help us to maybe kind of rethink how we use certain terms related to like non-binary and genderqueer in the present moment, and kind of what these writers can teach us. So I'm very much kind of centered on Godwin, but also looking at how he kind of influenced others within his kind of own moment, and also how his work can be seen to anticipate queer theory and trans studies today. So before I get into the sort of very specific, as in my title on the screen here, Rethinking the Paranoid Gothic, Productive Transgressions, Non-Reproductive Desire, and Gender Non-Conformity, what I'd like to do before I get into that more specifically is kind of talk about how I got into reading William Godwin, who he actually is, and how on earth I ended up looking at these specific areas. So the first time that I came across William Godwin was in, I think it was either a first or a second year module as part of my degree, and the module was called Transatlantic Gothic, and it was looking at a kind of 50-50 split between UK Gothic and US Gothic, and looking at the influences at play and how the genre kind of developed. And Caleb Williams was one of the set texts on this module, and I didn't really know much about Godwin other than that he was Mary Shelley's dad, and essentially I was kind of interested to know more about him. But we were kind of given a kind of blurb about what this novel was about, and it didn't seem overly kind of Gothic, I suppose, to what I kind of went in thinking, you know, Gothic novels have to feature, you know, this and this, all the kind of typical sort of stereotypes. And this was a novel that didn't really seem to feature a lot of those. If you're not really familiar with it, you know, for the purposes of what I want to talk about, it's kind of a novel that focuses on a sort of obsessive desire from Caleb Williams towards his master, his employer, Falkland, and he becomes completely, for some reason, obsessed with kind of knowing everything about him, wanting to kind of have this inseparable relationship with him. And then the pictures that are on screen at the moment is the moment that that Caleb sort of discovers Falkland's secret that he committed a murder many years previously, and Caleb gets kind of really excited at this idea, and he thinks that he could love a murderer and all this kind of stuff. And it's a very, very fascinating novel for you know, I guess I wasn't expecting such a intense kind of same-sex, you know, depiction of a same-sex relationship from a novel from 1794. So it definitely, you know, even though I may have kind of originally judged it and thought, I'm not sure if I'm that interested to read this based on what it was, you know, the sort of blurb we were kind of given about it, when actually from a sort of psychological perspective, it does have a lot of kind of, you know, a lot of really interesting elements to their relationship. So the way that unsurprisingly, the way that I read their relationship, I thought it was quite an eroticized depiction from Godwin. The way that he portrays this relationship between these two male characters seemed to really be very, very passionate, very, I would say, very, very kind of sexualized. And I wanted to investigate that more and really kind of, you know, I decided to write about this for my dissertation at the time. So I started doing some, as you do, kind of some secondary reading, lots of research around what people had said about this relationship and if it had been sort of spoken about very much. And I was surprised to see there was hardly anything that had been written about this particular part of the novel. There was, obviously it was a relatively well-read novel. There was a fair bit out there that had been sort of written about it, but no one seemed to really be talking about the fact that this seemed to be quite an eroticized relationship. So I guess this was probably about 2009, 2010 I was looking at it at this point, and I kind of thought at this stage, I thought, oh, maybe I'm just reading way too much into this. Maybe there's, you know, these kinds of themes are not actually there. Maybe I'm just, you know, reading too much into it. That's kind of, I kind of backed off a little bit from thinking, oh, maybe this isn't an eroticized relationship sort of thing. But eventually I did come across one article that did focus on this potentially sexualized relationship between these two male characters. And that was Alex Gold Jr.'s It's Only Love, The Politics of Passion in Godwin's Caleb Williams. And this is a really fascinating article in how it sort of links the novel to kind of contemporary thinking about sodomy and sort of sodomitical practices that, you know, when you look at the kind of references to same-sex desire at this time, then what Gold Jr. is kind of doing is showing that Godwin is essentially kind of, I think Gold Jr. describes Falkland as actually being a sodomite, and how Godwin was actually portraying these characters in ways that was deliberately kind of mirroring the sort of homophobia of the time, really. So it was quite an influential article, and it was, as I say, it was one of the first to really kind of spotlight this theme of male eroticism. But Gold Jr. has got a very specific way of reading this kind of idea, in the sense that Godwin was simply damning the idea of relations that transgress from the kind of the sort of normal kind of version of love, I suppose, those that become, you know, so passions between men that become too passionate, too exclusive, too intense, too sexualized, then that's a bad thing that we should be kind of protecting society from. So that's kind of what Gold Jr. reads in this. So the quote on the screen there is the idea that Godwin presents their relationship as a regressive, disruptive, pathogenic distemper, and that it threatens to sexualize the social instincts to render them passionate and exclusive, with the disastrous consequences his novel details. And it is a very convincing reading of this particular novel. And I think looking at just Caleb Williams in and of itself, you know, it doesn't exactly show the most kind of positive depiction of this kind of relationship between men. So when you read the novel and then you read this article after it, it's kind of like, oh, maybe Godwin is kind of damning these relationships, and maybe you know, that is the way that we can read this. And at the time, I suppose I didn't really think to contest it that much, and particularly Gold Jr. was quite influential on this next book that I'm showing here, which is Between Men by Eve Sedgwick. It's a really, really fantastic book for anyone who's interested in kind of queer history. Sedgwick kind of goes all the way from Shakespeare to the 20th century and looks at a history of kind of queer sexualities, and it's just really, really fascinating. And this is a picture of Sedgwick writing this actual book, which I love, with the makeshift office and the cat. I just love that. So it was a really important work, and obviously the word seminal is a bit of a controversial term now, but I think something like this, it is a really, really important piece of kind of queer literary analysis. So it was a book that kind of gave a voice to queer subjects and subjectivities. And what Sedgwick was trying to do was to kind of go back through kind of literature, fiction from, across the sort of 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and kind of look at the inextricability of sex from history, essentially, saying that you can't look at political history, social history, cultural history without also looking at sex and sexuality, because the two are kind of forever interwoven. And the main aim of her study was to sort of show how patriarchal kind of power, gender ideologies are kind of the way in which they are established, sustained, and also challenged. So kind of by breaking apart patriarchal ideologies, how we can really kind of understand how they're kind of the root of a lot of problems, essentially. So how does, I've picked an image here that's kind of meant to portray Sedgwick's kind of this continuum she talks about, from the homosocial, which she calls the homosexual, saying that in an ideal world, it would be kind of the homosocial being kind of just friendships between like same-sex kind of platonic relationships, and the homosexual being a sexual romantic relationship, how one should be able to lead to the other quite problem-free, quite trouble-free, shouldn't be any issues. But in reality, there's a lot of problems along the way, thanks to the way that patriarchy operates. So Sedgwick kind of asked, why should this kind of relations, why should the shapes of the homosocial continuum be an interesting question? Why should it be a literary question? And the sense that by tracing kind of representations of homophobia within literature, what we can essentially do is not just trace kind of an oppression of homosexual men, but the way that the gender system operates as a whole, and we can sort of trace kind of history of that. So the way in which Godwin fits into this is that Sedgwick kind of turns to the early Gothic novel to say this was when we can sort of locate a sort of definite emergence of kind of homophobia in this literature, and a kind of homophobic trend within what writers were doing. So she calls it the paranoid Gothic tradition in the novel. And she essentially lists Godwin's Caleb Williams as kind of starting off this homophobic trend in the novel. So a sense that Caleb Williams kind of introduced this destructively passionate relationship between men, and that a number of other kind of authors and novels will come along and that would kind of replicate that and further explore that. So we've got obviously Caleb Williams, and then we had the other ones that Sedgwick lists in this sort of subset of novels was Anne Radcliffe's Italian, obviously Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we've got Melmoth the Wanderer, and James Hogg's Confessions of a Justified Sinner. So they all kind of feature, for how Sedgwick's kind of grouping them as they sort of feature to a certain degree male-male relationships that kind of mirror something like what we see in Caleb Williams, in the sense that they are kind of passionate but destructively so. So we have themes like desire, obsession, violence, and even kind of murderous intent. And even though we could read them potentially as being homoerotic, Sedgwick's kind of saying actually they're more about the fear of kind of homoeroticism and these relationships transgressing from the kind of safety of the platonic to something that's sort of dangerously transgressive, essentially. So just a quote here to read from Sedgwick, that she sort of says that the Gothic novel crystallized for English audiences the terms of a dialectic between male homosexuality and homophobia, in which homophobia appeared thematically in paranoid plots. Not until the late Victorian Gothic did a comparable body of homosexual thematics emerge clearly. In earlier Gothic fiction, the associations with male homosexuality were grounded most visibly in the lives of a few authors, and only rather sketchily in their own work. So Sedgwick's kind of cautioning against reading these relationships as being homoerotic, in the sense that we should read them more as being about the sort of fear of an imagined possibility of the homoerotic. So I was kind of, like I say, at first sort of convinced by this, because obviously these relationships in these novels are, they do sort of follow a trend, you know, that show these relationships to be quite problematic, to have a lot of disruptive elements to them on the surface. But then as I kind of got more familiar with Godwin's work, and I sort of looked at how his novels, you know, not just Caleb Williams, but this theme of kind of these intense male-male relationships, I thought that seems to be a very narrow way to kind of look at them, just to say that, you know, Godwin and these other authors were writing purely to kind of, you know, issue caution for these relationships. So my way to sort of revise what Sedgwick was doing here is sort of saying that I don't believe that Caleb Williams did kind of originate this kind of homophobic trend in the early Gothic novel, and to kind of reread this idea that these sort of relationships are not so much destructive to civilized society, but more that kind of oppressive social order within itself is destructive to the ability for these characters to express their desires, their feelings in any kind of meaningful way. So the sense that Godwin was kind of treating society as a destructive force and not the kind of queer protagonist, essentially. So to kind of rethink that relationship. And also to kind of push what we can do with Godwin's portrayal of male-male desire, not just about, you know, tracing kind of homosexuality, but also looking at how Godwin can be seen to have recognized kind of experimental queer forms of sexuality, gender, and kinship much more broadly. So kind of relationships between humans, not just, you know, not just male-male desire, but what he's doing is kind of, he's rethinking about, you know, relationships and kind of love and sexuality and gender on a much more kind of individual level. And yeah, so to kind of broaden this approach. So as I said before, I think it's really important that we kind of look beyond Caleb Williams to do this. It is a fascinating novel, and I know you guys have got this novel as part of your one of your book group novels coming up quite soon, and it is a really, really fascinating novel. I think for Godwin, I think it's important that you sort of take a broader approach to his novels. So I've got some examples here, the ones that I focus on, because he published, I think, 6 major novels over about, yeah, sort of 40 years or so. And this theme of kind of male-male, these sort of passionate relationships would kind of extend throughout these novels. And he would keep kind of going back to this theme. And yeah, so I think it's important that we don't just focus on, even though his most famous work, I don't think just focusing on Caleb Williams is necessarily all that productive if we want to kind of make a broader comment on what Godwin's actually doing with these relationships. And that's the kind of question that I ask, is saying, why would Godwin have simply been writing to kind of support and confirm the kind of homophobic political social culture of the time? You know, surely, I mean, when Godwin would write, often it would be to change things, to modify things, to question things. And so it seemed a little bit of a reductive reading to say, oh, Godwin was simply supporting this kind of commonly held homophobic attitude at the time. Actually, it's kind of, you know, it's more complex than that. There's more stuff going on. And that was my aim, to sort of say, actually, he's not damning these relationships, but he's more so damning the way in which society confines people from being able to live a kind of authentic life and explore their desires, passions, emotions, in any kind of meaningful way. So these are sort of some kind of ways in which the novels can be kind of linked. And Caleb Williams definitely did set a trend that would develop throughout the later novels. So plot lines that are driven entirely, or at least significantly, by the obsessive need of one man to possess the exclusive and unceasing attention of another man. And often he goes to quite some length to demonstrate how these men kind of perceive themselves in relation to their desires. So how it affects their perceived place or lack thereof within a patriarchal, familial, social and political landscape. So that it really that they kind of question their own identities almost, really. So there's lots of things that we see this manifest as. We have things like self-hatred and despair, a kind of rejection of their kind of prescribed familial duties. They kind of agonizing cravings and sensations of kind of incompleteness, and also kind of hope and utopian imaginings for what could be. So these novels definitely offer quite a varied window into these protagonists' minds, and I think I kind of look at them collectively, that Godwin sort of scrutinizing the effects of what it's like to have a deep-rooted desire that falls beyond kind of moral boundaries, so acceptability, and also what falls beyond that was defined as normal or natural within the sort of late 18th and early 19th centuries. So the kind of ill effects of a sort of repressed desire, I suppose. And I'm kind of arguing that Godwin recognized that, you know, individuals may have desires, emotions, feelings that don't fit a certain predetermined mold for what is right or wrong. So the fact that he kind of recognized the fluidity, indefinability and capability of sexualities and genders beyond those kind of only associated with the male-female reproductive kind of family, you know, normative family structure, that people might not fit into that, and that they shouldn't be forced to if that's not what they want to do as individuals. So one of the important areas here is kind of looking at how Godwin's work links with Mary Wollstonecraft, in what she obviously is, who was his first wife, and looking at the way in which both of them really kind of question the family unit and the kind of domestic ideologies of the time. So the sense that both Godwin and Wollstonecraft were kind of on the same page, in the sense that for them to bring about kind of political change and to for that to kind of progress, you have to start with changing the kind of family, and recognized how the family is a site of kind of perpetuating a lot of problematic kind of patriarchal ideologies, and how by kind of reconceptualizing the family unit, how that can help to kind of push through wider political change. So I guess the way that my work kind of fits into that is that I'm looking at how Godwin could recognize a kind of multiplicity of sexualities and genders beyond just the familial, so beyond the procreative. So the sense that you know, he's kind of recognizing that these, you know, the sort of normative family unit is not, you know, it needs to kind of be expanded and diversified, essentially. So these are the way that I read Godwin's portrayal of male desire. And the kind of first one is to sort of argue that Godwin recognized the need for individuals to express passions and emotions unchecked by kind of institutional control. And then the kind of the way in which you would counter the gendered ideology, so the way that women were supposed to desire men, you know, women were supposed to desire women, how Godwin was kind of saying actually these sort of predetermined gendered you know, roles for women and men to fit into didn't work. And how also he envisioned a redefinition of family and kinship beyond biological reproduction and blood relations. So recognizing the sort of creative potential for sort of human relation beyond the procreative, essentially. So what my project does more broadly is to sort of trace Godwin's influence and his connection with other writers. And I think it's, when I started looking at this theme, I was kind of looking at Godwin almost in a bit of a vacuum. I was looking at just his novels and seeing that this theme of male desire, how it progressed. But more recently, I've been tracing how he was linked to other authors of his time. And here I've got some examples. So I look at how Godwin kind of had an influence on writers like Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, William Godwin Jr., who were all obviously related to him, but also kind of writers that also influenced Godwin himself. So the way in which Mary Wollstonecraft's kind of feminism can be traced, within Godwin's treatment of gender and sexuality in his novels. Writers like Joanna Baillie, how her work, Godwin cites her as inspiration for one of his novels. So sort of tracing that lesser known kind of relationship. Because there hasn't been many studies looking at Baillie and Godwin. Also, Edward Bulwer-Lytton is someone who I also look at, who was definitely influenced by Godwin, especially kind of in the late 1820s, early 1830s. So this kind of community of writers almost, they kind of offer us essentially a kind of window into a queer romanticism. So how a lot of these, writers were all quite radically rethinking sexuality and gender at this time, and kind of recognizing that it was the much more diverse and individual, I suppose, than just that was supposedly natural within sort of the sort of political culture of the time. So what actually is, or how do I define a kind of queer romanticism? And it's first of all the idea that denaturalizing like the male-female reproductive sexuality, so recognizing that how certain forms of sexualities gain sort of legitimacy, like an appearance of being the only normal or natural kind of desire within patriarchal political structures, and kind of reconceptualizing sexuality and in turn gender and the family in progressive, expansive, and sort of non-deterministic ways. So it kind of links towards what Richard C. Sharp conceives of as the perverse romanticism, which is kind of recognizing how ideas of sexuality at this time were much more fluid, versatile, and undecided than they'd previously been addressed within existing scholarly work. I think often the Romantic era has been described by one person, I forget who it is now, but like a sort of asexual black hole, in the sense that often it's not seen to be like a particularly sexually explorative era, but actually there is so much that these writers were doing that, obviously kind of within that, the kind of Gothic writing has been recognized, but I think Romanticism more broadly as a kind of era, I think, it suffered from a kind of bit of a dearth of kind of queer readings, and, compared to people have sort of documented, has been quite a lot like queer Shakespeare, queer Victorians, but then the Romanticism kind of sits there not having as much attention in this area. So Shah kind of said that, this idea that the Romantics understood that, he calls it, humans and the human body had functionality beyond brute instinct, is how he describes it. So this sense that, looking at sexuality beyond the kind of just the procreative, and how the Romantic writers understood that there was a lot of potential beyond just the sort of the natural way to be, essentially, or what was considered as a kind of normal, natural way to be. So the way this links, although I try and look at interrelations between this kind of radical, expansive way that the Romantics were treating gender and sexuality, I look at how this links to queer theory and trans studies in the 21st century, essentially. So thinking outside those perceived natural boundaries, how that offers a connection to what queer theorists are doing in our moment, like within the 21st century. So kind of always questioning, always rethinking, diversifying, expanding. So just some examples here of what these are some particular queer theorists that I kind of connect to Godwin. So we've got Judith Butler, Jack Halberstam, Lee Edelman, Jose Esteban Munoz, and obviously Eve Sedgwick again, and looking at these really kind of pivotal, really important figures for the development of queer theory, looking at how their work and some of the ways in which they revise, whether it be sexuality, gender, I mean, a lot of queer, the way in which they focus on, kind of expanding kind of queerness just beyond a reading of desire and sexuality, but looking at kind of the impacts of it much more broadly, and looking at how what Godwin's doing with the male desire in his novels can really link to what these theorists were doing. So there's often a bit of kind of controversy with doing something like this, where you're kind of taking a writer like Godwin from the kind of late 18th, early 19th centuries, and you're kind of saying his work can connect to these authors, these writers, these theorists that would kind of emerge hundreds of years later. I think when I first started looking in this area, there was almost a kind of lot of discouraging from doing that, like the sense that we can't really supposedly modern ideas of sexuality and gender, etc., into, you know, the literature of Godwin's time, because these writers could never possibly have conceived as something of something akin to what we today understand as, sexuality and gender in the 21st century. And there was often quite a lot of barriers put up that, you'd seen that you would be accused of being anachronistic, not historically relevant, that you were sort of reading things into these works that weren't actually there, all that kind of stuff. And I think what it kind of does is I think that kind of barrier that's often put up between past and present, often you get the sense that kind of cisgender and heterosexuality has a kind of unbroken history that we can read into any point in time, and often those kind of readings were not questioned. But when you do a kind of queer and trans reading of something, that's when you kind of get a lot, oftentimes, the kind of accusations of not being historically relevant, in the sense that these authors could never have possibly, conceived that, being trans is supposedly a modern thing that could never have existed at that point. And I've had that thing, presented at some conferences earlier on. I sort of had those kinds of assumptions, saying that, it's dangerous to apply these supposedly modern, and I'm thinking there's a bit of a double standard going on there. But yeah, so essentially there's kind of two perspectives kind of two kind of ends of this kind of debate about how we kind of go to queering the past, if that's what we want to call it. So essentially, Foucault kind of pinpointed 1870, I don't know why particularly that date, but this idea from when sexuality went from being just about an act, a sexual act, to becoming something of like a sexual sensibility. So that's kind of, he sort of pinpoints that time as when, we can trace sexualities kind of emerging as a thing in the later 19th century. And then before then, apparently, they didn't so much, what we think of today as sexuality apparently didn't exist before then, according to Foucault and other writers like Trumbach as well. And so obviously these kinds of perspectives would advise against assuming sort of pre-late 19th century writers could have conceived of anything that we understand today as sexuality and gender, so kind of really discouraging us from reading that. On the opposite side of that, we have those kind of critics that try and search for indisputable evidence to prove that sexual identities definitely existed in the 18th and early 19th century. So Richter Norton is probably an example of someone who's quite well known for doing that. So basically kind of encouraging readings that centralize homosexuality and kind of try and search for evidence that this definitely did kind of exist. And I think both sides of that debate are potentially kind of problematic. So I think saying that, this idea that we can't locate modern sexualities in literature that kind of predates the 20th century, I think it's quite circumscriptive and unnecessarily so. But also I think, and as it also assumes that in today's moment that we've kind of got everything figured out and that we've got things defined and explicit and we understand sexuality in a way that these writers could never have done. But actually we don't have everything figured out today. Things are not completely defined, and it kind of, it sort of relies on kind of hasty assumptions about the obviousness and definability of sexuality in the present day. But I also think that sense of trying to locate that evidence for homosexuality at this time as well is a bit of a problematic one as well, because it's relying on quite rigid definitions of what we're meant to be looking for, and this sense of kind of searching for definite things at this time that again can be a bit misguided. So I think within Romanticism, I suppose the way in which these writers approached gender and sexuality was kind of so open and so kind of complex and so diverse and so layered, that trying to kind of pin it down to any kind of one, you know, like to say this is an example of the homosexual at this time, I think it doesn't really tend to work. And critics like David Siegler say that romantic sexualities were kind of even too complex for us to perhaps fully ever understand, because, you know, the way in which they kind of thought about sexuality and also gender, you know, kind of just to a modern reader, you know, perhaps it's beyond our comprehension, because they were kind of so, you know, kind of experimental and so yeah, kind of radical in what they were doing. So the essentially, yeah, this sense of I guess a lot of it comes down to language as well. So, you know, the kind of language we use when we're looking at these themes, and this, you know, kind of moving away from terms like homosexual, heterosexual, to do these kinds of analyses, because, you know, and that's why queer is such a useful way to do this, because queer can be so many things and it can apply to so many things, and it's not, you know, you have to kind of pin it down to a particular definition. And that's why I think it works so well. So yeah, so my study isn't so much kind of like a queer reading of Godwin so much, like looking back at Godwin's novels through a kind of lens of queer theory. Essentially, it's looking more at a kind of genealogy of thought, really, kind of like countercultural thought from Godwin to queer theorists of the present day. So kind of, yeah, looking at kind of broader genealogy, essentially. So yeah, sort of thinking about how queer theory can be seen not so much as a kind of modern phenomena, but more so like the more visible end of a kind of broader genealogy, in which the Romantic writers can be seen to have played a really important role. So essentially, it's kind of looking at how what I do kind of looks at how both queer theory and Romanticism can really benefit from this, I suppose. So kind of tracing a kind of broader history for queer theory, and also recognizing Romanticism's important place in you know, kind of in broader thinking about sexuality and gender, so in ways that it hasn't always been appreciated before. So just to pick out some examples from Godwin's novels now, and I've talked quite broadly about his novels and about what I'm sort of looking at in a sort of general sense, but I've picked out some parts of his novels that I think are quite interesting for showing what I'm sort of talking about here. So in his novel Saint Leon, which was published in 1799, it was his second major novel, we have a kind of similar, sort of like Caleb Williams, a fairly similar obsessive kind of male-male relationship between Reginald the Saint Leon and Bethlem Gabor. So there's kind of quite the way that I read this novel, that there's quite an obvious split between Reginald within his kind of family life and then outside of the family life. So kind of we're looking at him as a husband and a son, an heir, a father, and how he's kind of obviously he seems quite unstimulated and quite bored in these kind of roles. Both him and his wife Marguerite are sort of encouraged to marry and you know, live this kind of respectable life, as, you know, married, having children, and neither of them are particularly happy doing so, but they're kind of encouraged to do so because it seemed to be the right thing, and it seemed to Marguerite's father sort of encourages them to, it's respectable, it's what they should do, but neither are very satisfied. So Reginald eventually, it's a very kind of long, complex novel, but eventually he becomes separated from that kind of family unit, and he meets this individual called Bethlem Gabor, who he seems to, all the things in his life that he seemed to be wanting and desiring, this man appears to be offering him. And the way that Godwin portrays their relationship and Reginald's feelings for Bethlem are just so, yeah, I've got some quotes basically. So he talks about being secret. Reginald says that Bethlem secretly endeared him to me. So this idea again of the sort of secret feelings, these things that can't fully be expressed or verbalized, and this idea of an exhaustless pleasure that Bethlem Gabor offers him. He electrified me, and we frequently continued whole nights in the participation of bitter joys, whatever these bitter joys are. We don't really know. It's just kind of shown to be it's a sort of mystery of what happened in these entire nights they spent together. But yeah, Godwin's kind of showing, very similar to how we get Caleb Williams talking about his feelings for Falkland as being these, I mean, I guess it's perhaps a little bit more explicit in Caleb Williams talks about loving Falkland, but certainly with this sense that we have this male-male relationship that seems to be transgressing from a lot of realms of acceptability, and hence there's this kind of a sort of, you know, dark, mysterious element to these relationships. And the bit that I suppose is kind of maybe the most interesting part of this is when Bethlem Gabor essentially gets quite frustrated with Reginald and his advances, and he's kind of obsessed with wanting to be near him all the time. He just takes him into his castle and locks him in his dungeon, chains him to the wall, and kind of leaves him there to die. But he doesn't die. he stays alive for a long time, and Bethlem eventually comes back, and Reginald's not dead. So Bethlem sort of then says to him that he'll be his creature, he'll be his boy, and he's kind of now owning him like a possession. And Reginald, his reaction to this is quite extraordinary, because he says, first of all, his emotions are sublimed by despair. So he's kind of the sense that this torture, this kind of despair is almost kind of quite, you know, it's not exactly a completely negative thing. But in this particular quote where he says, "Was it a crime in me at this fury, and my tyrant produced the operation of a sedative and a cordial?" And essentially he's been sort of chained up by this man and left for dead, and then this man comes back and starts essentially torturing him. And then Reginald's kind of saying that actually I'm quite enjoying this, it's quite nice, it's quite reparative, it's almost quite soothing. And it's like, oh, okay, I mean, the way that Godwin portrays it, it just sort of, there's not a big drama made of this. It's just kind of like Reginald's like, yeah, I'm quite enjoying this. And I think the idea, was it a crime in me? Like, why would he ask that? It's kind of like, you know, it's obviously suggesting a kind of criminal element to his emotions, what this man's doing to him, and saying this idea that there's almost kind of like a sort of healing, reparative nature to this relationship, you know, for all those kind of years that Godwin was showing that the kind of family unit and those roles of being a husband and a father kind of were almost kind of damaging by the fact that they were so unstimulating and so ill-fitting for him as an individual. This kind of passionate relationship with this other man kind of becomes almost like a sort of relief from that. And even though it is obviously quite dark and quite, you know, there's a lot of torture going on, it's in some ways there's you know, it's obviously satisfying him in some kind of way that we never fully know, but certainly is kind of suggested to be kind of, you know, emotionally thrilling and satisfying. So what I think an example of how this can link to kind of queer theory is we have in Jack Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure. Halberstam talks about this idea of how disrupting kind of family roles and the family unit, and kind of stepping away from that to explore our kind of more transgressive passions and emotions, how that can kind of give more, he describes it as kind of unbecoming or undoing those sort of set roles of like, you know, sort of wife, husband, and kind of moving away from that to explore passions and feelings and emotions away from the family. And I think what's happening in St. Leon here seems to really be mirroring that. So recognizing a sort of like this idea of sort of pleasureful unbeing, so kind of transgression, like lights of sort of rainbow of emotions that were left so unstimulated in that kind of normative, acceptable romantic relationship. And, you know, Godwin's kind of showing how there's so much potential outside of that, or that's one way we could read this relationship. Anyway, I guess in this next novel, which is Mandeville, we see this idea of stepping away from kind of familial normativity and its ideologies in quite a more kind of, a more explicit way, I suppose. As you can see by the image here, there's a little bit of kind of murder and murderous intent in this novel. And a lot of people tend to read this novel as kind of rooted, like the relationship we see between Charles Mandeville and Clifford, that's the male-male relationship in this novel. But a lot of people tend to read this as rooted in kind of religious conflict and war and the other sort of, you know, the sort of setting of the novel. But I kind of think there's a lot more to their relationship than just that, essentially. And there's a particular, this just to say to you, this is obviously linked to Joanna Baillie's de Montfort. Godwin actually cites Baillie's de Montfort as direct inspiration for this. And again, de Montfort also features this kind of central male-male relationship between de Montfort and Rosenwald that has this kind of furious, passionate, unexplained quality to it. And Godwin was obviously quite inspired by that to then replicate it within Mandeville. So that's quite an interesting connection there that sort of connects those two texts. So as I was saying, he becomes kind of obsessive about Clifford. Again, there's this sort of need to be close to this person, but then he can't be, and there's all this kind of these issues that are thrown up there. But one quite extraordinary scene in the novel is when Henrietta, who is Mandeville's sister, she kind of enters a romantic relationship with Clifford later in the novel, and then Mandeville starts to talk about how he imagines himself kind of living in Henrietta's body. So he says, I learned to despise myself, to go out of myself. I left my own rejected and loathsome corpse to live in another, to feel her pleasures, to rejoice in her joys. So he kind of describes, he imagines like Clifford and Henrietta's kind of romantic union and how they'd have all this kind of like affection, this love. And then he imagines himself living in Henrietta's body, which is just so extraordinary and so interesting, and also links directly to William Godwin Jr.'s later novel called Transfusion, which would explore this idea of transfusing souls. And specifically, we see a brother and sister relationship where the brother becomes jealous of his sister's relationship with another man, and the brother then sort of transfuses his soul actually into the sister's body to experience this relationship for himself. And we actually see this directly anticipated in Mandeville here. And one particularly extraordinary scene is when Mandeville then goes on to imagine the imaginary children of Henrietta and Clifford, and he imagines himself stealing them and teaching them to hate their parents and then murdering their parents. And it's just, I just find it's so compelling, just so like, it's just an extraordinary, moment in the novel where, so Mandeville sort of says, these children will be living substantial beings in whom the blood of Clifford and Mandeville should be mingled together. Can nature sustain such monsters? I'll steal them, I'll teach them to hate, make them the instruments of my vengeance. And how it would delight him to see their infant fingers stream with their parents' blood. So he's got obviously quite a lot of issues going on in this novel. It's quite dark. It's definitely quite psychological, and we're definitely kind of given a very kind of direct window into his troubled emotions towards it. All kind of stems from this inability to sort of pursue what he wants to do with Clifford. And I think this idea of the kind of imaginary child and the kind of queer protagonist relationship to this kind of reproductive future, I think it links to Lee Edelman's No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive, which it's basically it's a work of queer theory that sort of looks at, kind of says that the future is just for kind of cisgendered straight people, and it's like a sort of reproductive futurism, and how queer people should focus just on the here and now, and that it's obviously it's a bit, that's kind of a simplistic way to say it, but essentially Edelman kind of calls upon this idea of a kind of imaginary figure or child of the future who's seen to be representative of kind of a sort of reproductive familial future in which queer people don't have a place within. That is what Edelman kind of says. And I see obviously this idea that Godwin's putting in here of this imaginary future child. And I think what's interesting though is that Godwin isn't so much kind of showing that kind of Charles Mandeville is directly damaging to this child, but rather there's this sense that he's kind of I suppose it's all of his kind of damaging by society that's led him to become this kind of crazed, unhinged individual that we see here. So another sort of scene that Godwin's showing his protagonist to have these quite unusual sort of fantasies actually becomes a sort of a realized moment in his novel Fleetwood, where the Casimir Fleetwood, the protagonist, has quite strong feelings for another man. This time it's a character called Kenrick, and when Casimir's wife Mary enters into what he believes to be a romantic relationship with Kenrick, Fleetwood actually goes and, as you would, he goes and orders these like bespoke life-size wax models of his wife and her supposed lover, and he kind of rents some private apartments, and he plays them these wax figures like a duet of love, and he cooks them a meal, and he kind of sits and watches them, and then he actually imagines them coming to life. So he says, you know, he imagines, he looked from one figure to the other figure and they grinned and chattered at me, and he imagines them kind of acting out this kind of loving scene before him, and then they turn their attention towards him and they start laughing at him and ridiculing him, and then he ends up going and getting in such a state that he then a full and proper madness seized me, and he sort of tears these figures to pieces with his hands and with his teeth, and it's just such an extraordinary scene. And again, it's kind of all again sort of stemming from some kind of repressed something within the protagonist that kind of leads them to this point where they end up, you know, doing all these quite crazed, quite bizarre things. So I think obviously these are quite extraordinary scenes. What Godwin seems to do quite a lot is really invite us to a degree to kind of sympathize with these protagonists. They are quite problematic individuals. They have got a lot of, you know, it's quite difficult a lot of the time to like them or to feel comfortable with them, because they are quite, yeah, they do a lot of strange things and seem to be quite, you know, damaging. But actually there's so many moments in these novels where he's really kind of, Godwin's trying to say, well, this is why they're like that. So particularly from like in Mandeville, we see this idea where Charles says, if I could have given vent to the various emotions Clifford had excited within me, I should have become a different man. So the sense that it's the fact that he wasn't able to express whatever these feelings are, these various emotions that lead him to be the way he is at the end, is kind of, you know, child stealing murderous figure at the end. Were I assured of his love for me, I should have never gone mad. So again, you know, it's sort of, it's tracing that sort of destructive element, not to the queer individual, but actually to those, some sort of external force that's constraining them from being able to kind of give a kind of voice to, or be able to express these desires. And in Fleetwood, we have a lot of sort of moments when, you know, Godwin's kind of spotlighting on this idea of Casimir being alone, and he talks about these heartbreaking delusions of a pretended friendship. And again, sort of, I think Fleetwood's probably the least, he's very, very difficult to sympathize with, because he is just kind of annoying character, but there's still nonetheless a lot of moments when Godwin's kind of sort of showing, inviting us to feel some kind of sympathy for him. And then in St. Leon, we have this idea that my heart panted and seemed bursting with a secret that it was death to reveal. Obviously some sort of, you know, emotion that was punishable by death that he's experiencing, whatever that could be. And he says things like, I wanted some friendly bosom in which to pour out my feelings, but this was forever denied me. So there does seem to be a lot of you know, these kind of recurring times when Godwin really is sort of encouraging his readers to maybe not make a sort of quick judgment about each protagonist, to say, oh, they're clearly, you know, destructive, and we should, you know, what the things that they're doing, you know, these feelings have for other men are terrible things that shouldn't, you know, exist. Actually, Godwin's kind of saying, look at the reasons why they end up the way they do, and a lot of it can be traced back to this inability to kind of be their authentic selves and, you know, sort of explore these emotions that they have. So to sort of bring things to a close, I thought I'd end on a slightly more kind of positive note here, which is to look at Godwin's Cloudsley, which is I suppose something of an anomaly within Godwin's novels, because it's quite, we move away from those kind of themes of terror and panic and jealousy, envy and murder and disaster and all this kind of mental and physical breakdowns of his earlier novels, towards something that's noticeably more kind of positive, really, and almost kind of utopian. And that theme of a kind of close male-male relationship continues into Cloudsley, but it's quite a different angle from which Godwin pursues this. So we have this story of the kind of romantic friendship it's described that's forged between English orphan Julian and the Italian bandit Francesco. And it's quite overt, really, in how Godwin sort of portrays their relationship. So that we have this idea that the first sparks of friendship grow to a point where Francesco is described as dear to Julian beyond any other person in the world. And I think what it tends to show is that, I think, unlike Godwin's other protagonists, Julian kind of has this ability to hope and kind of imagine and not let the kind of factors in society that are kind of constraining him to sort of define him, essentially. So he sort of has an ability to imagine beyond that and kind of hope for a kind of a world in which him and Francesco would be free to love one another unimpeded. So we have this idea we can read elements of a kind of queer utopia into this novel, especially Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia, which talks about the idea of kind of queer world making and this sense of like, you know, kind of queer utopia isn't the sense of living an idealistic, you know, free, you know, life in the present moment, but it's kind of being able to imagine that as a possibility one day. And we sort of see this in some quotes I've got up on the screen there, where Julian talks about being desirous of all occasions of intercourse and intimacy with Francesco, and how they both regarded the world as if it were not, and swearing they would build a temple of attachment and love and retire to an uninhabited island with one another. And I just think it's such a kind of interesting way to see that Godwin's approaching this relationship from a different perspective. That obviously kind of in Fleetwood, we had Casimir describe that romantic, if not impossible, friendship he talks about wanting to form. And then in Cloudsley, Julian kind of refuses to accept this kind of impossibility of a kind of queer relationship. And actually he imagines that it could be a reality, and it could be something that would one day exist. So this novel does end in typically kind of Godwinian chaos and disaster. So Francesco is eventually arrested, and then he's later hanged, because obviously he's a bandit and he does bad things. But I kind of say that the kind of doomed conclusion doesn't kind of negate that sort of utopian potential in the novel. So it's kind of the sense that it really does offer a kind of example that Godwin's saying this is the way that such a relationship could be, if only it wasn't for the sort of destructive social forces that are you know, turning it into something that it, you know, becomes quite damaging because of the sort of the inability to properly pursue it. So this kind of offers a glimpse of a relationship. You know, if you were to compare kind of Julian and Francesco's relationship to, say, Charles and Clifford's relationship in Mandeville, we see a lot of similarities, but a lot of key differences, in the sense that there is this utopian element to this relationship. So I thought, just to finish on this kind of final quote we have here from Cloudsley, which is I think quite sums up what I've been talking about, which is the sense that Godwin talks, well, the Cloudsley ends with this idea of sort of celebrating just love, which kind of, you know, so the true system for governing the world, fashioning tender spirits of youth, is love and nothing else. And I think it just allows us to see that, you know, Godwin was clearly kind of in sort of imagining a future world in which humans would be free to be able to, you know, kind of pursue their passions and desires outside of quite an oppressive society. And I think it's got, you know, that kind of sentiment's got quite a lot of relevance in our moment, you know, right now, in the sense that a lot of things might be, you know, kind of been happening. You may be sort of being told certain things that you know, can kind of be quite negative, but its ability to kind of hope beyond that is sort of what makes, I think, Godwin's work particularly, what I would say, queer, in the sense that it's you know, it's kind of positively disruptive, and it's imagining for this kind of more open, expansive and loving future world that will be free of all the kinds of disasters that his novels detail. So yeah, ending on quite a positive note there compared to some of the earlier themes that we saw in his novels. So that brings me pretty much to a close, and thank you so much for listening. I hope it was interesting and useful, and yeah, thank you so much. I will now stop